my friend. Across oceans, deserts. Seen things few men have seen.
The fewer still will believe.
The end is in sight.
Hello, and welcome to Media-eval, a medieval pop culture podcast, where we talk about how movies, TV, and books depict the medieval world. What did they get right? What did they get wrong? And what do they tell us about how modern people see the medieval past? I'm Sarah Ifft, a medieval historian, and today I have with me Megan Tripp. Hi, Megan.
Hey, how are you?
Good. So today we are talking about the 2011 movie Season of the Witch. So I know that I did inflict this movie on you, but why were you at least perhaps somewhat interested or acquiescent in the idea of talking about this movie?
From what I could remember about it, it seemed like it was going to be lighter fare than perhaps other things. So I thought, oh, that seems like a fun movie, if not a good movie. So sure, I'll do that.
I will say at least it had the benefit that it moved along relatively quickly for a lot of it.
Yeah. And it's like, what, an hour and a half? It's not particularly long.
Yeah, so it has that great benefit to it.
Short, raves Megan.
And starring Nicolas Cage, which is a mixed blessing, I suppose.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, I really should go back and watch more older Nick Cage movies. The only older Nick Cage movie I've ever seen is Moonlight. So I feel like I'm missing out on, like, peak Cage because I keep seeing him in, like, Sorcerer's Apprentice and National Treasure and things like that, you know?
Yeah, I think one of the movies I've seen him in where he's actually good in his own way is Face Off.
Okay, yeah, I've heard good things about that movie. Like, it's crazy, but it owns its own crazy.
Yeah, like, it's really silly, but Nick Cage's performance works as a crazy performance, and John Travolta's kind of does too, and overall, it's not a bad movie, which is not necessarily something that can be said for this. So he is playing the Crusader Behmen von Bleibruck, with Ron Perlman also playing a Crusader named Felson. Claire Foy is the person who apparently we find out, and I'm pretty sure the last 5 minutes of this movie is named Anna. And I have not seen her in anything, although she does play Anne Boleyn in the new Wolf Hall miniseries. So that's something to look forward to.
Yeah, I've seen her as the queen, but that would be obviously like in the 1940s, so
right,
well outside your purview.
Yeah, I could watch it, I haven't, but it is beyond the ambit of this particular podcast.
Right, on your own time.
Yeah. And then when I looked up the credits, I found out that apparently under the Plague Buboes, Christopher Lee is playing Cardinal d'Amboise.
I missed that totally.
Yeah, I just literally only found that out when I Googled it, so good for him. He's in it for like 5 minutes, so.
Yeah.
So a kind of very brief recap just to orient us before we get into some more general discussion in our section called Enumeratio. 2 deserters from the Crusades are deputized to take an accused witch to a remote monastery that specializes in witches. They are accompanied by a priest, a knight, an altar boy who wants to be a knight, and a seller of false relics. The knight and the relic seller both die en route, while the witch eventually reveals that she indeed has supernatural powers. When they arrive, they find all of the monks dead of plague and soon realize that she's not a witch, but a woman possessed by a demon, who has deliberately led them there to destroy the last copy of a magical book. They finally exorcise the demon, both ending the plague forever and saving the woman who is apparently named Anna. But everyone dies except for her and the altar boy, who ride off into the sunset after burying Behmen, Felson, and the priest de Belzac. This movie starts out in 1235 in Villach, where you have a bunch of women who are just being accused of witchcraft and of consorting with the devil. So they're asked to repeat and then confess their sins, and one kind of quickly confesses, and another begs for mercy, and one kind of spits in the priest's face, and it's all just a really fun time with men killing women, basically. The woman who confesses also kind of indicates that she had assumed that by confessing she was going to get not killed. And then the priest instead goes, "Ah, your soul, child, your soul will be spared, but your body must be consigned to God for absolution." This all also happens around a bunch of medieval castles which are already in ruins, despite it only being 1235, which is kind of impressive. So the priest starts to read from the Book of Solomon, I guess just kind of making sure that the witches are not going to be able to rise from the dead, which is a thing in this movie. So he kind of goes through that. But of course, a witch does rise from the dead and drown him, to which at this point, honestly, my response was just kind of, good. Then at this point, the movie just kind of goes into, all of a sudden, it calls something the Age of the Crusades. Did you realize at this point that we are going to be jumping a full century into the future?
I mean, the first note I have is the Gulf of Edremit,
yeah,
something like that, and that it said 1332. So I don't know. I never saw that note about like it's the Age of the Crusades. It just said 1332, and I was like, oh, okay.
That's so odd, because mine I don't think had a date on the first one, but it said the Age of the Crusades. Although maybe I missed something. It definitely said at some point the Age of the Crusades, because I spent a while being mad about it. But
I wonder if there's like a different version for Netflix or something.
Yeah, potentially.
Maybe enough people were like, why won't you give us a date when you give us a date for literally every other card that calls out where we are?
Right, but this one, as I said, the version I saw at least just had this kind of vague, it's the Age of the Crusades.
Right.
You know, that historically specific time period. The CGI in the Crusade scenes is so bad. I mean, so you're like watching these battles and there's these moments where you're like, this just looks like a mediocre video game. But I guess they spent all of their budget on Nick Cage, who I guess got a pretty decent paycheck.
Probably. And is blonde at this point, right?
Yeah, he is. It's weird. It's not a good look for him.
It is not.
So we watch Christians yell things like, "We'll be baptized in the blood of our unholy enemies." And Nick Cage and his buddy Ron Perlman, who are not even trying to do any kind of European accent, their accents are just aggressively American, are basically just wandering through the Crusades and apparently murdering Muslims more or less for fun and using it as the basis of who gets to buy drinks that night.
Yeah, I guess they're like counting as they're going, like, okay, I killed 30 men, you killed 32. I guess I have to buy drinks tonight because I killed fewer people than you did.
Right, which they have that kind of murder competition in battle in Lord of the Rings between Legolas and Gimli, who are killing orcs. And I feel like in Lord of the Rings it kind of works because the orcs are not really human. I mean, they're very deliberately kind of dehumanized and made into these kind of evil monsters. But it really doesn't work with actual human Muslim people and makes these characters seem just extremely unpleasant, to me at least.
Yeah.
We then have a kind of rapid-fire tour through Bayman and Felton's crusading experiences at the Siege of Tripoli in 1334, the battles of Imbros, Arta, and Smyrna. Spoiler alert, with one exception, none of these battles took place anywhere near in time to where this movie says they do.
Yeah, that's not surprising. This movie doesn't feel super historical.
It's such a weird combination at this point of being very intense about including very specific dates, but simultaneously having apparently picked the dates just completely out of nothing.
Yeah, it was almost like they wanted to set it in something like Middle Earth, and then at the last minute we're like, what if we made it about real life?
Right, which was a very odd choice. I feel like this movie would have worked better if it just hadn't bothered to be quite so specific in terms of exactly when it was being set. And then they did, and then people like me noticed and start complaining about it. They're on Crusades, and I guess becoming increasingly disillusioned about the crusading experience. So at some point, the leader of their crusading band says, something like, "Let's go get the enemies of God." And then they have this conversation where one says, "Do you ever get the feeling God has too many enemies?" And then the other responds, "Being his friend's not so easy either." Which I think should be on the short list for the prize for things that a medieval Christian would have been least likely to have ever said, in this kind of odd tendency that you have in medieval movies for people to just like not take religion seriously at all, despite the fact that they're on crusade and you would think they would.
I don't know. These guys, they seem like they're there for glory. They do not care about God at all. So I don't know how many glory seekers there would have been.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely would have been some people who would have gone on crusade in part just, for seeking glory, or honestly, kind of because they wanted to kill people or because they were bored.
Right. I have nothing else going on.
Yeah, right. It just definitely seems odd, especially because they bring up at some point explicitly that they decided to go on crusade, or at least that Felsen did, because they were concerned about remission for sins.
I took that more as a fun story to tell around a campfire, but had like wasn't actually true, but it was just his way of being like, I sin a lot. I'm a badass.
That's fair. I was probably taking that statement too seriously. I was probably generally taking this movie too seriously. So the disillusionment continues when Nick Cage accidentally murders an innocent civilian, which for some reason really bothers him at this point, despite the fact that he's been on crusade for 10 years and it's not believable that this is the first time he's murdered an innocent civilian. But this time it's very upset about him, so they just take off.
Where are they supposed to be? This like walled city thing? Like where is that supposed to be?
Smyrna, which is in what is now Turkey, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, that's at least ostensibly what that is. And actually is the only real battle.
So I don't know if this is like grounded in any sort of truth or not, but I did notice that he only seemed to care about killing pale people.
Yeah, that's a good point. I noticed that as well, that it's super weird that the civilian that he accidentally murders is very much just looks like a white European lady.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the problem.
It could just be that he's racist and he's like, oh, I'm killing one of my own in some way or form or fashion or something.
Yeah, that's very possible.
Not surprisingly, this movie doesn't really like deal with like race or any larger question there.
Oh no, it does not. I was going to say I think the other problem could potentially be that they just decided they didn't want to bother hiring anyone for this movie who was not white, since I think the Muslim soldiers might actually be just CGI.
Oh, very possible.
Like, it would not surprise me if there was not a single person of color that they hired for this movie.
Very, 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 very possible.
So at this point, they take off and end up on the coast of Styria. They refer to this as being 1 month later, if I believe. It actually should be 1348, because at this point they make clear that the plague has started, and I am unreasonably annoyed about this. In terms of things that it would be so easy to get wrong, and I feel like 1348 or so easy to get right, and I feel like 1348 is one of the very few dates that some number of non-medievalists actually know.
Yeah, I don't know how much research they did. They probably like found one date and then just was like, okay, I need the story to move ahead to this part, so I guess it's like a year later? Sure, let's go with that.
Right. Yeah, the research was clearly extremely minimal, as in I think the research that I did for this podcast episode might have been more extensive than the research done for this movie. So they're hanging around, they're seeing a lot of dead people. Ron Perlman starts explaining about how he has nothing to eat. This was also the moment where I personally, as a Jewish person, am watching this scene and I'm like, I know he's a crusader and he's wearing like a giant cross on his chest, and I still just can't believe in Ron Perlman not being Jewish. Which is also adding to him as like, he and Nick Cage are just not coming off as convincing crusader knights to me.
Not to mention, how old are these guys?
I don't know. I actually am not quite clear, like probably in their 50s?
Yeah, I would say like late 50s. And they're like on the front line of like infantry. I don't buy it.
Right. It seems a little odd that it seems like they're roles that probably should have been played by slightly younger men, although I guess they're also supposed to be disillusioned, so I don't know.
I mean, I feel like you could be disillusioned in your 30s or 40s. You don't have to be in your 50s.
That's true.
I don't know. We could talk about this more when we talk about alternate ways this movie could have gone, but I was a little confused that they were like just out of the army and that they had abandoned their post or whatever. I was like, it could just be many years later. You don't need this.
Right, especially because the whole Crusader deserting thing that happens subsequently is a little silly anyway.
Yeah.
So they're now in medieval Europe, so everything is extremely gray and everybody looks miserable. We have some flagellants, so people hitting themselves, whipping themselves in the background, which is fine as a thing that was happening around the time of the plague. But also I'm very confused as to why all of those men look like they are 80. Like, it's a very elderly group of people injuring themselves, as opposed to, you would think, maybe some, I don't know, younger, stronger people who are better able to hold the whip for themselves. So there's some random child who sees the crest on Bayman's sword and then identifies him and points them out to, I guess, the guards of the cardinal, who has them arrested. The cardinal, who is suffering from the plague and apparently is Christopher Lee, brings them before him. He is being attended by these doctors who have these bird-like plague masks, which I have thoughts about that will come up later. And the cardinal and this priest de Belzac start explaining that the plague is supposedly a curse from hell that has been brought upon them by an evil witch, as you do. So the cardinal then offers Bayman and Felson, I don't know, absolution, freedom from whatever their penalty is, something for their desertion, if they agree to take the witch to the Abbey of Severac, where they have the last copy of this thing called the Book of Solomon, which is what they were reading from earlier, and can therefore destroy the witch's powers and end the plague forever. My immediate reaction to this is just, if this movie actually ends with, we're gonna, I don't know, kill some woman and then end the plague, I'm gonna be really fucking mad. But, so they end up agreeing to do this after spending some time reflecting upon whether the penalty for desertion involves hanging, burning, or both. Spoiler alert, it's neither. They agree to take her to Severac as long as she gets a fair trial. Then we get our nice kind of traveling party together. So it's our two crusaders, de Belzac the priest, and Eckhart, who is a knight. They also ask to get a guide who actually knows what the hell he's doing, because none of them do, because none of them have ever left whatever godforsaken village they're supposed to be in. So they then find this guy who's currently in the stocks, who is, I guess, has been arrested for selling false relics, although he claims to have happy customers from here to Prague, and confirms that he has previously made the trip to Severac because he previously sold the monks there the tale of an ass ridden in the flight to Egypt, which, I'm going to be honest, I did laugh at that joke. In that it was, I don't know, it's like, okay, that's a solid relic joke. You know, there aren't enough good relic jokes.
I've often said that about relic jokes. There's just not enough of them.
So, en route, they end up getting an additional companion, this kid named Kai, who is an altar boy in service to the cardinal, but I guess his dad was a knight, and now he wants to be a knight, and he thinks that if he goes with them, he can become a knight. Also,
Yeah.
he just looks like he's 12, and I can never get over the fact that he looks like he's 12, and they really should have sent this actual child home immediately.
Yeah, he can't quite grow out a mustache, so he has just a little bit of fuzz. And what's Ron Perlman's name? Is it like, I want to call him Fezzik, but that's not right.
I think it's Felton.
Felton insults him, and they end up having a little bit of a sword fight, I guess, for this kid to have his honor, and he holds his own a bit, and they're like, okay, well, you're not terrible with a sword. I guess you can come if you want to.
Right, and it's like, no, send that kid home. So they do keep the kid and start en route, and Bayman starts chatting a bunch with the suspected witch, who no one has given her a name, have they?
No, in all my notes, she's just girl.
Witch. Nameless lady, as you do. Starts to chat with Bayman, talks about how nice he is, expresses all of her fears about whether she'll actually receive a fair trial based on seeing the trials of witches in the past, which are less than fair. And Eckhart also begins to express his concerns about the whole thing, in part because the witch apparently reminds him of his daughter Mila, who died, I think, in the plague?
I think so, yeah.
So the witch ends up attempting to escape. There's like this key that's shaped like a cross that she pulls off of either the priest or Eckhart. I kind of that this was like only half paying attention for just a bit, and then I was like, oh, something's actually happening.
Yeah, she grabs the cloak of Eckhart, smashes his head into the bars of the wagon she's in, and then stabs the priest so he can't move with his cross off of his hand. And she also grabbed the key and fled.
Yeah, so she takes off. They're all chasing her. They come across a mass grave. There's also a cool dog at the mass grave, which, I was excited to see the cool dog. And Eckhart starts to hear and see dead people, specifically his dead daughter, Mila. So he's running around trying to find his dead kid. Carmen is very concerned about this as well, apparently. As you can tell from that plaintive meow. And Kai, the 12-year-old, accidentally just kind of runs up at Eckhart and stabs him. So apparently this kid knows what he's doing with a sword maybe wasn't the best idea, since the first thing he actually does with the sword is stab their friend.
Yeah, it's weird because he comes around the corner. Eckhart is startled, but continues running forward because he sees his daughter. And then everyone's telling Kai the rest of the time, it's not your fault. It's because of, the witch and supernatural stuff. And Kai's like, no, I think I'm to blame. And I'm like, you're somewhat to blame. You could have dropped the sword. You didn't have to hold on to it and make sure that he managed to shish kebab himself onto your sword. That seems like it took some effort on your part.
Right. It seemed very odd to me that, or odd in the sense that he clearly was at fault, I guess is really what it meant. It seemed very much like the kid, if he'd actually been somebody who was a bit more battle-hardened and kind of knew what he was doing, wouldn't have been running around corners with the sword out like that.
Yeah.
And would have been a little bit slower, a little bit more cautious. And so essentially the reason Eckhart got killed is because he, doesn't really know what he's doing, which obviously happens, but it is definitely his fault. The witch is recaptured. She's got a solid evil smirk at this point, and I definitely was having a moment right about here where the movie was sort of working for me in that I was like, okay, initially I just assumed she maybe wasn't a witch, but maybe she is a witch. Is she actually evil? Is she, maybe a witch but not evil? Or is she just some lady who got tortured? I'm curious. Maybe we'll find out. The movie relatively soon, however, loses the goodwill that it managed to get during that 5 minutes. For me, at least. I don't know. To what extent did you feel like you were really engaged?
I thought the casting of so much older leads without much explanation was weird.
Yeah.
But when we're like, okay, we're going on a quest and this girl may or may not be a witch, I was like, okay, cool. I like quests. I can get on board with that.
Yeah.
And weird, spooky stuff happens. And I kind of liked the end, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so there are definitely things about this movie at the moment that are kind of working. So they then have a traumatic bridge crossing experience.
It's a total Shrek bridge.
A total what?
Shrek bridge.
Oh, yeah. So the priest gets some real intense rope burn with his hands are
that was so
completely
gross.
bloody and gross. Yeah, which I also definitely was watching this and I'm like, that's ridiculous. You don't get rope burned like that. But then the next day I ended up walking 3 dogs at the same time with kind of hefty leashes. And I was like, oh, okay, I can almost see it. So there's a lot of them trying to get across the bridge. The witch keeps saying that they should let her go so that then the chariot will be later because they'll just have to carry her separately. This seems like an obvious... I mean, she's probably right, but also it seems like an obvious ploy to escape.
Oh, yes. Can't blame a girl for trying, though.
And I think everyone just basically ignores her.
Yeah, they're like, yeah, we're not
we're definitely not doing that. Come on. We're not done. Especially because she's tried to escape 10 minutes ago. It's not like she's got a lot of goodwill.
No. And then someone died. So it's like, no.
Our dumb 12-year-old murderer nearly falls off the bridge, but the witch saves him with one hand, pulls his entire little childlike body up from before he falls off, which is definitely witch-like in terms of powers at this point. So
it's definitely the first time you're like, oh, there's something wrong with this woman. Like,
yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
what it is, but there's something going on.
Yeah, no, the spooky stuff happening, she might be responsible for some of it.
Yeah.
So they eventually make it across the bridge. The bridge is completely destroyed. Nobody seems worried about the fact that this bridge, which is apparently the only way to get between that thing that looked like it was at least a substantial town and this monastery, which purports to be of some importance. And now they've just destroyed the only way of getting in between them. But nobody seems to think it's a problem.
It's weird because, like, at the beginning, there's so much thinking about getting there quickly that the priest is like, we have to go as the crow flies. And then Nick Cage's character is like, but that's like fording a river and going through a spooky forest where people die. Like, could we take another route? And then they grab Hagamar, the relic seller, and you're like, okay, we're going to get like an alternate route. And then they don't have to ford a river. They can go over this bridge, but it's in disrepair. And then they end up in the same spooky forest. And I'm like, Hagamar, the whole idea of you being on this trip is you providing us a different way to go.
Right. So either there was zero other route or I don't know, but it seemed kind of ridiculous that they definitely did spend all this time creating this kind of or having this conversation about finding a better route, and then they did not find it.
Yeah. Because then they're like, oh no, we're in the spooky forest. And I'm like, well, where did you think you were going to end up? Like,
right. Oh, yeah, the spooky forest. That's obviously the thing that was on the other side of that bridge.
Right.
You know, the bridge that you tried to cross despite the fact that it was literally falling to pieces.
Yeah, you probably should have, like, gone downstream where it wasn't quite so high and then forded it like a normal person rather than trying to cross this ridiculous bridge with this heavy wagon and multiple horses.
Right. And at least some of them are planning on going back.
I think all of them are planning on going back, aren't they?
I mean, at least the priests, at least like the priest and the kid are. I don't know what Bayman and Felson's plan is. I suppose they don't technically have to go back. They could go anywhere they want.
Right.
Like they don't have any roots there in particular, as far as I know. But at least a couple of them are actively planning on returning there.
And then if the witch is found innocent, which she won't be, but like if she were, she would go back, right?
Right, yeah, because presumably that's where she's from.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily want to be a woman who's previously been accused of a witch and then just try to find a new place to live completely alone.
Although maybe you don't want to go back home where everyone secretly still thinks you're a witch. I don't know. There's
Also
no
true.
good. There's no good way to get out of there.
No, not really. I am, however, kind of here for her very snarky comment. It would be a shame if he bled to death after she sees the priest's super gross rope burn.
Yeah.
Oh, I kind of like her. I wish she had even slightly more to do, but I kind of like her. So they realize that they are now, of course, in the scary evil forest. You know, the one that they were supposed to be trying to avoid, but I guess didn't. And Bayman then finally realizes that the woman really is a witch because she also, I don't know, like sets something on fire for a second. And he goes, but so that's exciting.
What does she do with fire? I totally missed that.
Oh, I think she just like starts a fire for a split second in front of him.
Oh, I must have like looked down. I totally missed that.
Yeah, it's like a split second. Well, it's okay. I actually then missed and did not realize quite what had happened until later. So I noticed, I saw the next part, which is that Hagamar starts saying maybe it would be easier if we just murder her.
Yeah.
And then she calls some wolves.
Yeah.
Apparently the wolves kill him. I 100% just missed the wolves killing him.
Oh, yeah. They circle them. They fight off some of the wolves. More wolves come. He, like, falls off his horse or something, is left behind. They try to get to him. By the time they get to him, eaten by wolves.
Happens. But, man, the false relic supply is going to go real downhill, so that's sad. So they finally end up arriving at this monastery, but all of the monks are dead of the plague.
Don't go past my favorite line, though.
Oh, yes, sorry. That at some point in the meantime, Bayman starts yelling. I guess like he's arguing with de Belzac, and then Bayman just goes, "No man has spilled more blood in God's name than I." Like, all right, dude, you don't need to brag.
There's that, and then like before they get to the monastery, Falcon and Bayman, I think are their names. They're talking about like what they're going to be up to afterwards. And it's like, no one will believe the things we've seen and experienced. And Falcon says, but we will know the truth, my friend. We will know the truth. Which is like a hokey line, even if you were able to deliver it well. But Ron Perlman does not deliver it well.
The dialogue in a lot of these conversations between these men wandering around is very hokey. Yeah. And a lot of this scene, I don't know, a lot of these scenes, especially, it also seems like Ron Perlman in particular is really kind of half-assing his way through. I'm not sure I'd call Nick Cage deeply committed to his role either, to be honest.
Yeah. There's moments where Nick Cage is doing like, I'm a very important rich man voice, which is different than his regular voice. And then other times where he's just like, I'm Nick Cage.
But even when he's doing that voice, it still is not a European accent of any kind.
No, it
they
is not.
Still always sound just aggressively American.
But one is very important.
Right, it's just, sometimes he sounds like an American industrialist from the 1920s, and sometimes he sounds like Nick Cage.
Yes. And, Perlman just sounds like Perlman.
Yeah, and Ron Perlman is just like, dude, come on, we all know that you're like a New York Jew. It's fine.
It's fine. It's good. It's whatever.
I don't know what you're doing in medieval Germany, but like we all just know you're a New York Jew, and that's just totally fine. Just keep going. They finally arrive at the monastery. All of the monks are dead of the plague. Many of them are they seem to have all just died instantaneously of the plague in this very odd way. None of them seem to have been like in bed or anything. It's just like, oh, I'm in, a chapel and I was praying and then I just killed over dead of the plague. And I was in the middle of copying a book and then I just killed over dead of the plague, which is not really how the plague works. You would have been ill for some amount of time prior to that and lying in bed like the cardinal was. It's not like a sudden death.
Yeah, they got like a supernatural strain of the plague or something.
Right.
Well, we're gonna get there.
Yeah. So everybody's dead. De Balzac starts, yelling some things in Latin at some point. And then they actually find the book that the monks are in the process of copying. It is the Clavis Solomonis Regis, the book of the rituals, prayers, and incantations used by the holy men throughout the ages to defend against evil. And I will say, bless their hearts, at the bare minimum, the title is a correct translation of Key of King Solomon. And so at least, what? They use some correct Latin. Good job, guys.
There you go.
They also, I believe, do have the correct Latin for the Nicene Creed, which is one of the things de Balzac is kind of yelling at some point. Of the other Latin, I could not make out them speaking quite well enough to have transcribed it myself without basically spending a lot of time sitting in front of my TV watching this movie and going back and forth and pausing. So I did not do that. They did, I will say at least, use some number of words that I was able to catch that were Latin that made sense in context. Yeah. But I cannot confirm, because I did not hear well enough, that they actually were saying any sentences that would be entirely coherent in Latin.
Right.
We'll see. I'm not sure I would expect that they did, but maybe they did. They start with the trial. The trial is apparently seems to mostly just be de Balzac kind of yelling at her in Latin from this book.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether or not she's guilty. Go ahead and try to de-witchify her with your book, and then if she's not a witch, she's not harmed. And if she is a witch, then I guess something bad happens to her, and she's not a witch anymore, or something.
Right. It also seemed odd because in the scene at the beginning, they had to actually kill the witches first for the rituals to take the effect of, I guess, making sure they stayed dead. But they didn't do that. They just start yelling incantations at her in Latin.
Yeah. Maybe if the monks in the abbey were alive, they'd be like, no, you've got to kill them first, and then you do the incantation. Because it's not like the guy knows all the ins and outs. He's never seen this book before. Maybe he, skipped a page or something.
That's true.
Page 1, kill.
Also, it's not impossible that maybe his comprehension of the Latin is kind of mediocre. So, he can read it, but does he really know what he's saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. They start basically, yelling Latin at her, as you do. She starts yelling back about how the church has been burning, hanging, and crucifying everyone who has stood in their way for centuries. I was deeply surprised to hear how much time the church has been spending crucifying people, personally. I mean, because obviously that's how Jesus died, so they kind of make a point of not crucifying people, like very deliberately. That is not a punishment that Christians use.
Yeah.
So it seemed very odd that they felt the need to include that statement.
Yeah, that was like a Roman thing.
Right, yeah, and that's why
and then it fell out of favor with the church coming into power, so yeah.
Right, and especially because it has now symbolic significance in terms of the crucifixion of Jesus. They actively wouldn't want people to then associate that with just common criminals, which is what it used to be associated with.
Because now it's like associated with martyrdom and stuff.
Right, yeah. So even though obviously there are saints and whatnot that died in various other ways, crucifixion definitely has a kind of special place in everybody's hearts, and so it's not being used as just a regular punishment anymore. So it seemed like just an odd thing that she needs to include, but that's fine. She can. And also apparently she's like both an evil witch / maybe something else, but also is deeply concerned with the fate of the innocent and how the church is harming the innocent.
I thought she was just trying to get Nick Cage to be like, oh, she's right, let's not hurt her.
That's true, I guess. Because then I guess she starts talking to Nick Cage about his past fun crusade experiences and kind of trying to manipulate him into feeling guilty himself about his past sins.
Yeah.
And all the people whose blood he spilled in God's name, etc.
Right.
At this point, after she starts going through this whole thing, de Balzac realizes that this is no witch, and then turns in the book to the exorcismus section, and turns out she's, I guess, possessed by a demon. Sure enough, as he starts reading new stuff to yell at her in Latin, she sets the wagon on fire and gets kind of dark and spiky and then looks kind of zombie-ish for a bit.
This is when I started getting really interested in this movie. When I was like, shit, it's a demon, then I was excited.
Yeah, I was like, all right, I can kind of see this as a way of, having some legit supernatural material, but also, not necessarily going with the woman was an evil witch the whole time. I told you so. We should be killing women. Which is an issue in some other movies I've seen.
But, I mean, if they killed her, the demon would have just jumped to a different body, I guess.
Right, so
that's what demons do.
Yeah, so they can't just kill her. They actually had to, they actually have to exorcise the demon and actually kill or somehow get rid of the demon.
Right.
So they're kind of starting to try and fight her. She then, I guess, or he, I guess, for the demon, I don't know what pronoun we should be using for the demons. Based on the voice, I'd go with it being a male-coded demon. Turns into a bird and flies off, or a bird-like thing, at least.
I mean, it has wings.
Yeah, a bird-ish thing. At which point somebody goes with we're gonna need some more holy water.
Which is we're gonna need a bigger boat of this movie.
Exactly.
And that made me wish that this whole movie was at this level of bonkers.
Right. I feel like when the movie had just like really ridiculous dialogue, it was definitely when it was at its best.
Like there's so many moments of like being very dour and being very like sad about the Crusades, and I was like, man, if this is just a silly movie about let's go town to town killing demons and we're gonna need some more holy water, I would be so much more engaged.
Right, if this is basically just a crazy kind of silly medieval version of The Exorcist or something.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd be down.
Yeah, that would have been way more fun. So now we're trying to defeat the demon and save the girl. There's actually this whole dialogue where I think Felsen goes, are we trying to defeat the demon or save the girl? And Bayman just looks and goes, both, which is also kind of very cheesy and silly. They're going off. Bayman, or I can't remember if it's Bayman or Felsen, somebody knights the rando kid who then says... Bayman does, yes. Who then goes, I know in my heart I've not earned this. To which I'm like, yeah, no, you totally haven't. And then Felsen goes, you will.
You will. Yeah, I kind of was like, oh, he's going to say that he's gonna. Oh, yep, he just did.
Yep. They also realize at this point that the demon was actually trying the whole time to lead them to Severac, and had in fact killed Eckhart because he wanted to free her, as well as Hagamar because he wanted to kill her. Because the whole time the demon is just real fucking mad about this Solomon book, and is especially upset that in the monastery they are in the process of copying it, and therefore sending its wisdom throughout the world. And that the demon then basically engineers this whole thing and makes everyone think the girl is a witch so that they'll bring her there, and then it can destroy the book and plunge the world into endless darkness.
This seems overly complicated. If I were a demon, I'd just go directly to the monastery and then indwell one of the monks. Now, I don't know, is there some sort of rule where you can't indwell monks because they're too holy or something?
So I guess they could argue that maybe, I don't know, they wouldn't be tempted, but technically anybody could be possessed.
Yeah, so I'm like, why would you pick a random woman from a random town, make her look like a witch, and hope that she gets taken to the place where Solomon's book is so that they do witch proceedings so that you can get a hold of the book? Just like, go there. What? You're a demon. You can manifest anywhere. Why do you need this ridiculous plan?
Bare minimum, you'd think it was actually that he could at least possess somebody who's within much easier walking distance of this monastery.
Right. There's got to be a closer town than the one they came from.
Right. It took them like a week to get there.
Right.
Isn't there at least somebody who lives in a town that's like a day away?
Who knows?
Or like, I don't know, somebody who works at the monastery at least, if he like doesn't want to deal with a monk. I don't know.
Yeah. And everyone just like jumps to, of course, I understand it so clearly now.
Obviously.
And I'm like, what do you mean? Like the girl was possessed by a demon, you misdiagnosed her, and now you feel dumb about it, and you're like, well, that must have been that tricky demon's plot all along. And it's like, not necessarily. Like, just because you didn't know she was possessed because you don't know what you're talking about. Like, anyways.
Yeah, which is of course ironic because, as I'll talk about later, demonic possession was totally what people would have jumped to more than witchcraft in the 14th century.
Right.
So, just saying. Now we get to have a battle in the monastery, which I'm a little sad about because now they're going to be destroying this perfectly nice Romanesque monastery and its, I'm sure, very lovely library that medievalists would have loved to have in the future. But no, we're going to burn up and destroy everything.
It's the demon's fault.
It is the demon's fault. So the demon then at this point resurrects the corpses of the plague-infested monks.
Yeah, sort of. They're like reanimated.
Yeah, so they're just reanimated corpses. Yeah, so yeah, reanimates as opposed to resurrect. So the reanimated corpses are then crawling over the walls and ceilings, and my god, the fucking CGI here.
Honestly, the whole reason that people find demons so creepy is the idea that you could look at someone, think they're somebody else, or think they're totally normal, and then the next moment they're doing something supernatural or are dangerous somehow. They should have just looked like monks. They didn't need to have crazy faces or do crazy things beyond just trying to hurt our heroes.
Yeah, I think that would have been much creepier if they'd been just regular monks and then all of a sudden it turns out they're already possessed by the demons, or if, you know, he possessed somebody who's in their group. I think that would have been much creepier. Yeah. But yeah, instead we get these like ridiculous CGI plague-encrusted monks and the demon who also, as we start to see eventually, the actual demon who is very stereotypical, you know, horned, winged demon type and is honestly just a little too silly and heavy on the CGI to be that scary.
I liked the design, but everything looks, because there's no practical effects here, everything looks like very fake.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe if they'd done practical effects, it would have worked better. The demon kills de Belzac. He, I guess, what's the word for it? Snaps his neck while he's in the process of reading from the magic book. Mm-hmm. He also eventually kills Felsen, which I was a little sad about. Goodbye, Ron Perlman. Felsen, kind of is I think at some point you kind of thought he killed Felsen, and then Felsen gets up and grabs him, and the demon just sets him on fire, and he crumbles to dust. So
yeah,
there goes Felsen. The demon is the only character, I swear to God, who is trying to do an accent in this movie. I don't know what that accent is supposed to be, but it is an accent. They're continuing to fight the demon. It turns out that the 12-year-old altar boy is able to read in Latin, so that's convenient. And so he kind of picks up where the priest left off and starts reading in Latin to continue the process of exorcising the demon. And Bayman, meanwhile, kind of pins the demon against the wall. I think he stabs his wings with something. Yeah. And so kind of pins him to the wall. Meanwhile, however, the demon does have a lot of claws that he is using to stab him, and so that's not going great. I don't know why he can't do the fire thing that he just did to Felsen a minute before.
I think he has to, envelop someone in order to do that, and he can't envelop him, so he's just, stabbing him, but he can't, get his wings to touch or something.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's actually a reason, or just because this is the end of the movie and he has to die soon.
Right. The demon finally explodes after the kid has finished reading the end of the Latin, but Bayman has been stabbed a number of times and therefore dies. We have lost our heroes.
Yep.
Rest in peace, Nick Cage. And with the death of the demon, the woman appears naked and very wet for some reason.
Gooey.
Yeah, it's kind of gross. This is also the moment where I went, wait, okay, so there's this one woman in this movie, and the entire time, though, it wasn't even her. It was a demon who is implicitly kind of male in her body. So essentially, This movie has 0 female characters.
Yep, she has one scene after this.
Yep.
Where she is herself.
Yep. So... yes, after this, everyone is dead except for the woman and the 12-year-old, and we see them burying everybody else, at which point she starts talking about how, it's so sad that they did so much for me, and I never even knew them, indicating that it really was she wasn't even there really in mind the entire time. She had no idea what was going on. I don't know where she was, but it was not there. And this is also the first point at which we find out what her name is. In the last 3 minutes of this movie. Her name is Anna. Yes, we finally know her name. I have a test that I have instituted on this podcast called the ifft test, where for a movie to pass, there has to be one named female character that doesn't die. And I feel like this movie technically passes the letter of the test, but in spirit, it does not pass.
Wow. That is such a small hurdle to jump, you'd think.
There are a surprising number of movies that do not pass. It's an even lower bar than the Bechdel test, which is also a quite low bar. Yeah.
It's one named woman and she doesn't have to talk to anyone about anything.
Yeah, exactly. I want one woman.
Just has to not die.
Yeah, I want her name to be mentioned in the movie and I want her to survive. And there are a number of movies that do not pass, and I think it is questionable whether this one does, on the grounds that she might be named, but is she really a character if she is not really in the movie as herself until the last 3 minutes?
She's more of a vessel.
Yeah, I'm not sure a female vessel counts for this. Yeah. It then tells us at the end that the plague passed and life returned to the land, and they don't know the darkness that almost was. So apparently by killing this demon, they ended the plague forever and immediately, which must have been so nice for everybody.
Yeah. Hooray.
Hooray.
We did it.
We did it. I have a lot of thoughts about the historical accuracy or lack thereof in this movie, which I'll be starting to talk about in the next section, Vera et falso, or true or false. There are a couple of things that this movie actually got right. The monastic scriptorium, where they're copying the book, looked more or less right, and the very brief shots that we get of the book show that, at the bare minimum, there are some illuminations that look like they maybe could be 11th or 12th century. There's something that looks kind of like a medieval bookhand. I don't know, maybe somebody looked at 4 medieval books before coming up with this, which, that's honestly a higher bar than I would have guessed for the research in this movie. The town that they have at the beginning, Villach, is a real town, although they presumably found that basically by Googling. They have the kind of brief reference visually to the flagellants, the people whipping themselves, and those were a group of people who kind of arose in the context of the Black Death. It's a kind of penitential movement with the goal of basically, if we have this kind of extreme form of penance, then maybe God will take the Black Death away. The sale of false relics is also a real thing. So I appreciate that they kind of brought up that as a real medieval social phenomenon, because we know it's certainly that there are way too many breasts of St. Agatha and heads of John the Baptist for all of them to be real, and very possibly none of them were. And the other thing is that ultimately I have some questions about how well it worked, but that at least in a better movie, the idea of presenting the medieval world as one in which people assume that the supernatural and demons and representatives of the devil can have a real impact on how things happen in their world is a quite good way of thinking about how medieval people saw God and the devil. And this kind of magical realism, I think, could really work in a good movie. This might not ultimately have been that movie, but the concept, I think, was one that could work. There are also some things that I guess I would say there's kind of a little of each. One big thing there is witch persecution. I complained about this a lot, that witch persecution is really an early modern phenomenon rather than a medieval one, and people keep placing it in the context of the Middle Ages because they like to pretend that things got better in the early modern period when instead they arguably got worse. So the heyday of witch persecution is really the 16th and 17th century, and so this kind of big moment of persecution of witches surrounding the Black Death in the 14th century is not the thing that makes the most sense. There, however, was sort of a real book called the Clavis Solomonis Regis, which contained various spells that were supposed to summon, control, and purge demons. However, while this would have been a good thing to have on hand to get rid of demons, it does not seem to have been especially something that was targeted at getting rid of witches. It also was obviously very much not composed by Solomon. This is not a book of the Bible. This is something that got composed in the late 14th or sometime in the 15th century, and then passed off as being something that contained the wisdom of Solomon, but is very much a representation of kind of late medieval Renaissance magical traditions.
Yeah, when they kept on saying Solomon's book, I'm like, oh, are they transcribing like Proverbs or Song of Solomon or something? And then realized, oh no, they're talking about the magic spell book.
Right. Yeah, my initial reaction was, I'm sorry, what the fuck is this fake biblical book that they're making up called the Book of Solomon? Because while there are books authored by Solomon, or ostensibly authored by Solomon in the Bible, none of them are called the Book of Solomon.
Right.
But yes, instead it is this magical book, which, as I said, good for them. Somebody clearly did 5 minutes of research and found out that this is an actual book, although one that was in existence slightly later than this movie is supposed to take place.
So when did you say it was supposed to have come out? Like in the 1500s or?
Like a little earlier, probably the 15th century, although the earliest manuscripts that we have of it, I think, are not until the 16th. And this is not my area, but I think based on kind of the language, like the language and stylistic features, people think it's probably 15th century. So, and there's also I think, Greek version that seems to be not an exact translation, but related, and that's 15th century.
Okay.
That's about it for things this movie got right. There are then a lot that it got wrong. So the big one that I want to highlight is, so it begins, in at least the version I saw, that it said that we're now in the age of the Crusades. This term is arguably all but meaningless, but if there was something called the Age of the Crusades, it would aggressively not be the mid-14th century. This is because the last crusade to the east, or to the Holy Land, ended in 1291 after the fall of Tripoli and Acre. So, 40 years before the main part of this movie starts. Although crusading did continue elsewhere, so in the Iberian Peninsula and in Eastern Europe and the Baltic. It never actually says in the movie that Behmen and Felsen are Teutonic Knights, which is a particular order that's associated with crusading in Eastern Europe and the Baltic, but that is what they are identified as, at least in the description of this movie. But if they are Teutonic Knights in the mid-14th century, they would be nowhere near the Middle East. They would be in basically Poland, Estonia, and Lithuania. They're kind of hanging around in the wrong place. And then you have the battles themselves. There's something called the Siege of Tripoli, which is dated to 1334. The term Siege of Tripoli most often refers to a battle that's in the early 12th century, and the closest we could possibly get to 1334 is the Fall of Tripoli, which is in 1289. The Battle of Imbros I found to be an especially funny one because not only is it not something that takes place in the mid-14th century, it's not even medieval. There is one Battle of Imbros in 1717 and another that is in World War I.
It's a pretty big gap, both of those.
I'm just kind of wondering where they pulled that particular name from. That one seemed especially bizarre. There also was they mentioned the Battle of Arta. Again, this is a battle that was fought in the context of the Crusades, but in 1105, not in, I think they dated in the late 1330s. There was, however, a Battle of Smyrna in 1344, which was part of a military expedition that was intended to counter Turkish piracy and was blessed as a crusade by the Pope, although very clearly motivated by political as well as purely religious concerns. That one battle at the end, there could have been people who thought of themselves as crusaders who were fighting there. Just that one. I also decided that I wanted to look up exactly what would happen if you deserted from the Crusades, since they start talking about how worried they are that they're going to be hanged or burned for doing so. Crusade deserters often did not even receive a formal punishment at all, but just received a kind of social censure because they would have been considered to have been oath breakers because they made a vow and then did not fulfill it. I specifically then looked up what would happen to members of the Teutonic Order. So if you basically were in the Teutonic Order and fled from the army in the midst of battle, which is arguably what they would do, they would be punished by being expelled from the order, which is exactly what they wanted, apparently.
So that works out.
Yeah, so it was actually, they really shouldn't have been that worried, and probably no one would have been really trying to find them except to kind of grab them and then say, you're out, you can never come back. So yes, desertion from the Crusades is a little bit off here. And finally, I am unreasonably angry about the plague masks that the doctors attending the cardinal are wearing, because these are particularly famous masks associated with plague doctors that were not invented until the 17th century. So you've very possibly seen these before. It's the kind of weird masks with the big bird-like beaks. As I said, they are a real thing. They're just a real thing that you would have seen primarily in Italy and France in the 17th century.
Yeah, even who I don't know much about history, when I saw that, I was like, are they in Italy now? And in the future?
Right, that it's very much something that's associated in particular with Venice. I think there's a lot of kind of famous engravings from Venice of these plague doctors wearing these particular masks. But they would not have been in appearance in the 14th century. That, by the way, leads into the fact that, surprisingly, the Black Death was not just ended forever in 1348 by killing a demon.
Oh, man.
I know, right? Ugh. Like, you'd think you really should be able to just kill demons and then just end disease. Like, that should be how it works.
Yeah.
Sadly, it does not. That leads into the next segment, Historia et Veritas, or History and Truth, where I talk about a real historical event. And for this, I wanted to highlight a couple of things in relation to the Black Death. First of all, the Black Death first appeared in Europe in about 1348, which, again, I am unreasonably annoyed at the fact that it implies, based on this movie, that it started in 1344, because that seems like something that they could have gotten right just by saying 4 years later instead of 1 month later, and it really wouldn't have bothered anybody. The Black Death also was not caused by witches, nor did anyone even think it was caused by witches. Some people thought it was caused by some kind of filth in the air, so a lot of people were worried about things like, oh, let's maybe, make sure to throw away our dead animals who are lying around in the streets, because that kind of filth in the air is what causes plague, which at the very least, was probably a good idea to get rid of your dead animals lying around in the street.
Sure. It sounds nicer. I wouldn't want to be in a street with a lot of dead animals in it, personally.
Right, yeah. Or, things like, actually, let's, kick out the, butchers because they're bringing plague into the city by leaving out the animal carcasses too long. There were also people who were concerned that the plague was a punishment from God sent because of their own sins. So, they did things like maybe complain about how the women are dressing too nicely, or how, maybe we shouldn't be tolerating all of these prostitutes that we're really into. Or, alternatively, the big group that then got blamed for the onset of the plague was not witches, but the Jews. Jews who are aggressively not in this movie, with the exception of Ron Perlman, were blamed by a number of people for the plague. There were two different kind of big versions of this. One is that the Jews were actively causing the plague by poisoning the wells. The other is that the Jews were not themselves doing anything to cause the plague, but that the plague was a punishment from God for being too nice to the Jews. And as a result of that, there were a couple of massacres of Jews in 1348 in a couple of places, including places that are now Germany, to basically, if we kill the Jews, they'll either stop bringing the plague upon us, / God will see that we have killed the Jews and he'll be thrilled because we were being so nice to them before they weren't. And that was a big problem. The witches here are this kind of odd stand-in for the actual persecution of Jews in the context of the plague. The other thing, of course, about the plague is that not only did it not miraculously end by conveniently killing a demon off in 1348, it eventually kind of dissipated but kept coming back. And so there are periodic plague epidemics throughout Europe all the way through the 17th century. And I think you can technically still get the plague today. I think it is now curable, but, it did not entirely go away and it certainly was not eradicated conveniently in 1348. As I said, it kind of keeps coming back and keeps the population levels to a kind of relatively low level until about the kind of late 16th century or so. If only they just found that demon. So I like to think that the eternal darkness that the world was to be plunged into if they did not kill the demon was actually just the Renaissance. Because I'm a medievalist, so I think the Renaissance is overrated and actually everything was either as bad as the Middle Ages, if not worse. With that, this is certainly a movie that I ultimately had some issues with. In our next section, Fabula Nostra, or Our Story, we talk about what kind of alternative movie we might come up with. So, Megan, what would you have liked to see out of this movie that was not actually the movie that we saw?
I think it would have been cool if instead of the Crusades, they're just a group of holy men with this book and they go town to town beating up demons and they chant some Latin, but they're also like slicing heads off left and right. I think that would have been more fun.
That definitely would have been way more fun.
There's no need to have the Crusades in this at all, actually. It doesn't really factor into it.
That's true. It actually would have made a lot more sense to not have the Crusades because nobody's crusading. Would you have still cast Nick Cage?
I guess it wouldn't have mattered in that case because it wouldn't have been like, he needs to definitely be older or younger. It would just been like some people wanted to go out demon killing. And he was like, yeah I'll do that.
And, he could be a kind of nice middle-aged monk.
Sure. Shave the middle of his head. Don't give him blonde hair.
There you go.
Movie fixed.
Maybe make him just a little less grizzled.
Yeah. What about you? What did you think?
I would like to set this movie in the early modern period, mostly because that is my kind of big hill that I will die on, is that people need to stop pretending that witch persecution was a hugely medieval thing and acknowledge that it's actually an early modern thing. Mm-hmm. So I would like to set this in 16th century Germany. And I really did enjoy the demon aspect, but I also kind of wanted there to be an actual female character. So my alternative version would have a woman who is a witch, but who it turns out she's actually not an evil witch, so that she's actually healing people and doing other kind of generally good things, but is accused as part of a kind of witch craze of being a witch and consorting with the devil and harming people. And especially given the kind of emphasis in this movie on faith and the loss of faith, I thought it would be fun to have a priest who I would have be played by Ewan McGregor. And he has basically spent his life supporting efforts to root out the Protestants and the Jews and then the witches but then has his faith shaken when he realizes that a witch, who I would have be played by Aubrey Plaza, is actually doing good overall, and that imprisoning her is actually making various people's illnesses worse because they no longer have her to help them. I think that would be fun. I'd also like to stick with the fact that the relationship is not actually going to be a romantic one, because that was one of the things that I appreciated about this movie, is that no one's trying to sleep with this poor woman who's in a cage.
Yeah, it was weird because there was some moments where she's trying to trick them, I guess, and saying that the priest like touches her inappropriately. And I was like, I could have lived without that.
Yeah, it was also very vague that it seemed like she was implying that he had raped her, but she didn't quite go out and say that. So I was trying to figure out the whole time, is that definitely what she's referring to, or is she just indicating that he tortured her quite brutally?
Yeah, they're vague, and I thought, oh, there's going to be like a story later about how they actually had a romance, like an affair, and then when it went sour, he called her a witch, and that's what this whole thing's about. And then like that never happened, and I was like, oh, never mind.
Right. And it then also seemed very weird to me that this priest, who implicitly has, because he doesn't deny that anything she's saying is true, and so it seems pretty clear that he did at the very least torture her, if not also rape her. And he thought she was a witch, but I mean, he didn't know the whole thing about her being a demon. And so then it raises a lot of questions about, okay, wait, so we have this dude who at the very least brutally tortured a woman and maybe also raped her, and now he's supposed to just be redeemed at the end, and we're going to think all that's chill?
Yeah, because you'd think he is saying like, oh, she's just trying to get a rise out of you and trying to like tear us apart, but he never actually says, I never did those things.
And he probably did torture her, at least. I mean, in the context, there's every reason to think that, especially because we know that she confessed.
Right. So usually in order to get a confession, there was some torture going on.
Yeah. So, yeah, bare minimum, it is unlikely that he did not torture her. And he never really denies that he tortured her. But as I said, then we're just supposed to be like, yeah, no, I mean, it's okay because he was really right the whole time.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how we're supposed to feel about anybody. I guess everyone's like an okay person except for the demon who's bad incarnate.
Yes. Which I'm not sure is ultimately the message I would get from this movie and from this particular group of people.
Yeah, it's like humans don't really have agency in this story because it's like, there's the will of God and there's the will of demons, and what you gonna do?
Right. Yeah, so the humans don't really have agency, and also the fact that it's then this evil demon then makes it also that essentially the kind of differentiations and shades of gray and good and evil between humans are basically irrelevant as long as they're trying to defeat this one demon.
Yeah, basically. It's
kind of a weird choice. And not necessarily a choice that I would make if I was making this movie. Let's move on to the next section, estimatio, or rating, where we say what we ultimately thought about this movie. So what rating would you give to this movie?
I guess it's out of 5, right?
Yeah.
I guess like 2.5. Like, I really do like when we go really crazy and we're just chopping heads off of monks and saying we're gonna need more holy water. Like, that is more fun in that one, I don't know, 20-minute segment at the very end than is had in the rest of the movie. And I don't know why they wanted to be so serious in a movie that ostensibly is about like witches and demons in a way that,
right,
I don't know, it like wanted to be very serious drama about like, don't just do what people tell you to, but also like is ultimately do what they tell you to because it's probably demons anyways. So it kind of like undoes its message halfway through anyways. So I can't say it's good, and I didn't think it really made sense to have your action heroes be Ron Perlman and Nick Cage at their ages, but I did have fun at the end, so I'll give it 2.5.
This movie had definitely some amount of moments where it really worked for me as a kind of good, bad movie. But ultimately, it kind of lost me in a couple of ways. I remained just irritated throughout about the Crusades and the fact that there was really no reason that this movie had to have in it as the background both the Crusades and the Black Death, things that took place a decent amount of time away from each other. And if they just not done that, then I think it would have helped just immeasurably with the historical accuracy.
It didn't even have to be the plague. It could have just been any sickness, really. They didn't have to make it seem like the Black Death. They could have just had any sort of sickness, really.
Yeah, if it was a miscellaneous sickness, then actually they could have made the argument that they killed a demon and then it ended forever.
Right.
So that actually would have worked better. Yes, they could have said it earlier and had them start off as crusaders and then do something else. Or they could have just had them come from, I don't know, some other war and be in an army and then end up in this whole situation with the plague. Or they could have been Teutonic Knights actually being where the Teutonic Knights were supposed to be.
Right.
You know, they could have had any number of ways for this to be not just ridiculously inaccurate, and they did not choose them. And then I guess my other big issue with this movie was the fact that they ultimately ended up making it such that there was not a female character at all in the entire movie until the last 3 minutes. And I'm really annoyed about that. Ultimately, I am going to give this on the basis of both a combination of historical inaccuracies and gender-related issues. I'm going to give it a 1, but I wouldn't necessarily say don't watch it. Which is the case with other movies that I've given a 1 where I've just straight up said, no, don't watch this movie. It's not worth your time. But this I would say, you know, if you're really bored, this could be worth watching.
Yeah, I mean, it's on Netflix. It's free. If you're homesick, go ahead and watch it.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that, just really strong recommendation. Thank you all for listening to us talk about the delightful-ish movie Season of the Witch today on Media-eval. So, Megan, where can our listeners find you on the internet?
So I watch made-for-TV movies, and then I talk about them. And I do that on my podcast, Not Another Bad Movie Podcast. So whatever you're using to listen to this is probably a good place to try looking for my podcast. All the usual podcasting apps and Apple Podcasts have it. And barring that, you can go to the website notanotherbadmoviepodcast.libsyn.com and follow us on Twitter at NABM Podcast. And yeah, I think that's all the info.
Great. I highly recommend it. I've been on a couple of times, and those are great episodes that you could listen to if you are fans of this podcast, but also any other episodes, because they're all great, and you've watched some amazingly terrible movies.
Thanks. I have watched amazingly terrible movies. It's true. Which is maybe why I'm so soft on this one.
That's fair. You have definitely seen worse movies than this.
Yes.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and have not done so already, please subscribe in your preferred podcatcher app. And I'd really appreciate it if you could just take a few minutes to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And in future episodes, I will be starting to read 5-star reviews. So if you want to make a virtual appearance on Media-eval, that's how to do it. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you via email at media.evalpod@gmail.com. That's media.evalpod@gmail.com. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Media-eval-pod and join the Media-eval Facebook group. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Sarah If Decker. Thank you for listening to Media-eval. Bye.
Bye.